Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Kilty. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. In our last episode, we covered, we really kind of started a new unit on the brain, right? We were talking all about the vital functions. Got a little bit of evolutionary biology in there, some fun things in our first episode. And today we're talking about kind of another, it's not truly a vital function, but Mike, I kind of feel like it almost counts because we're talking about movement. At least for most of evolutionary history, if you couldn't move and you're trying to survive in the wilderness, it's kind of a vital function, I would say.
Hey, tell that to the trees. That's all I'm saying. Like
Honestly,
they do
true.
just fine, right? But
As a
for
human,
us,
I guess
as a
we
human,
should clarify.
for us,
Right.
we're gonna need it. I'm like, you know what? I'm swinging the evolutionary biology back at you.
Love it. Honestly, thank you for that.
But yeah, absolutely. That's our topic today is we're talking about movement, which is so vital. And why, of course, we need to know it for the MCAT, but it's so interesting to learn because when it comes to movement, it's not just, hey, my muscle just goes, I just move. There's so many processes that are involved. And I think we forget about these things. Like moving is such like we just take it for granted. You're like, oh yeah, I picked up this pencil. Like that's nothing. But the coordination, the initiation, the brain areas that had to communicate just so I could pick up this pen, just so I could speak, it's beautiful. And we're just gonna we're gonna really be not diving as far as like the reality because there's so much involved, but we're gonna be focusing on what the MCAT's testing as well as some really cool applications. So I'm excited to really dive into it today.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're exactly right. Like this is so fascinating. And I think people understand, we've talked about muscle contraction before. I think we understand on a general level, right? We have a skeleton, we have muscles that, among many other functions, if we're talking about skeletal muscles, pull on our skeleton and create motion, right? But think about the difference if you were going to, right, like swing your arm for like to hit a baseball or something like that versus the fine motor control that you need to write your name, right? Like there's so many different types of movement and how the brain carries out something so fine versus so powerful is wild. It's so cool. And more than like just, oh, well, you use bigger muscles to do more powerful things. Like, okay, sure. But it's also a hugely, cognitive process, right? It requires a lot of brain control. So I'm excited to get into it.
Right.
And it has a lot of connections to a lot of different clinical cases as well, right? There are a lot of times that individuals experience paralysis where they literally can't initiate movement, right? We also have times that we have tremors. So like uncontrolled movements, the movement is being generated, but it's not being carried out in a coordinated, more functional way. There are times that maybe we are moving with some intention, but we're a little shaky, right? We're trying to move, but it's just not a perfectly fluid movement, right? Etc. There's so many different things that we could tie in with this. And most of it comes back to the brain.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we'll also talk about some like cool, like again, not only the real world applications, but also how's MCAT going to ask you about these things? What are they going to ask? And what MCAT connections can we throw in there? Because while, again, we know they love asking about topics that a lot of things connect to, right? And I think movement is one of those topics where it does connect a lot of things, which we're going to talk about today. And when we talk about movement, there's kind of like three phases to a movement, right? The first phase, which what we're going to talk about today, is initiating the movement. Like before I even pick up the pen, I need to first have the idea that I want to pick up the pen, right? And I need to send the signals to say, hey, I need to get the movement to pick up the pen. Then we need to coordinate. Okay, so now our brain areas need to coordinate. Okay, what are the things that I need to do in order to pick up the pen? What things do I want to volume up? What are the things that I want to volume down? There's certain muscles I want active and certain muscles I don't really need active in order to pick up this pen. And then it's on execution, right? Those are the kind of three phases. And we're going to be talking about all three, but really focusing on the first two because the first two are really what are critical in the brain, right?
Yes.
And let's first talk about initiation. There is like one part of the brain that's all about initiation of movement, and that is the motor cortex. Molly, take us through the motor cortex. What's going on with that thing?
I love talking about the motor cortex specifically because of the visual that I know we've both seen. Most of
Yes.
our listeners have probably seen it at some point. The motor homunculus, the weirdest, creepiest looking image. If you have not seen it, I want you to pause this podcast and go Google it.
Or maybe we could share a picture of it right now,
We
maybe.
could share- Absolutely nightmare fuel, to be honest with you. And it's basically it's a visual of a a human body that is basically demonstrating how much of the cortex in terms of space and real estate in the motor cortex, which I'll talk about in a sec, is dedicated to each part of the body. You're going to see hands, especially huge, tiny
Mm.
little arms, tiny little, like not the biggest chest, right? Not the biggest legs, but like hands, feet, face.
Tongue.
Tongue is crazy, right? This is a wild visual to start with, but what it is visualizing is what we call the motor cortex, okay, which is a part of the frontal lobe, which is really going to generate movement, right? And this is the true initiation, right? Like this is where the original action potential begins,
Mhm.
okay? And that's very important. I also want to mention here that this is backwards to what you might think.
Mm.
I always like to bring up the individuals that say with 100% certainty, "Oh, I'm only a left brain person.
Yeah.
I'm only a right brain person." Well, unfortunately, slash fortunately, you will never be that exclusive, right? The
Mm.
right side of your brain is going to control the motion and actually the sensation of the left side of your body, right? Left side of your brain does the right side of your body. Okay, so we're talking about regions of the brain that we initiate these signals to move your body around in space. And of
Mhm.
course, that movement is informed by a whole lot of different types of sensory stimuli that help us figure out how to move. But it's ultimately the primary motor cortex that will generate that signal to move, right?
Mhm.
And this is a pretty important place or a pretty important function. But even that is not quite enough. And in the context of initiation, before we get into different things that can change, I feel like it's important to bring in the basal ganglia because if you have someone who, let's say, can't initiate a movement, it could be that their motor cortex is impaired, right? There's actually many reasons why someone couldn't move. But if it's a problem with initiation and not one of the later steps, it could be motor cortex doesn't work, or it could be a problem with the basal ganglia. So, just as a quick note, right, with the basal ganglia, it's basically this region of the brain that is taking in inputs from the motor cortex. And pretty much by default, it's suppressing, right? It's kind of deciding as a gatekeeper, what do I want to let through to pass on to the next step after initiation? You might see that basal ganglia initiates movement. It doesn't, right? It's the motor cortex, but by default, these signals are not going to be passed on unless the basal ganglia agrees and
Mhm.
passes them on. So it's more of a function of suppression, but by reversing a suppression, initiation can proceed. So I feel like it's important to bring in basal ganglia here just as like not an aside. It's important to know for the MCAT, but like
Mhm.
a clarification,
Yeah, like
right?
the basal ganglia is so, so important for initiation. And there's actually so much I think we need to go into with the basal ganglia. Before we talk about the basal ganglia, I like talking about a little memory tip because the MCAT does expect us to know where the motor cortex is in the brain. It is in the frontal lobe, and I always kind of think about that as the frontal lobe is always where your decision making is where your like risk reward is happening. And I
Mm.
always think of it as like, oh, you want to think about a movement before you initiate the movement. So that's how I always remember, oh, the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe. So that's because that's where you have to think about it and then initiate it. So that's my little memory trick. But you're totally right. It's initiated there, and then on its way down, it has to pass that gate of the basal ganglia. It's this
Yes.
region that, yeah, absolutely, it's like gate close, and then if it allows it to open, then it goes through. And it doesn't just do that, also attenuates the signal where all the movements that are like, oh, like this is so small that's probably not meant to happen, those get shut out, and anything that's big enough to go is like, oh, you were on purpose. That's you were supposed to happen. That's why you were supposed to go. And that's how it kind of attenuates that signal. The basal ganglia is a really, really testable area because of Parkinson's disease. right? Because the basal ganglia is an involvement or a neurotransmitter that it targets the basal ganglia is dopamine. Now, when we talk about dopamine, its role is to kind of work at the basal ganglia and actually help to attenuate that signal. However, if you lack that dopamine, right, that means like the basal ganglia might not be working as well, and might not be able to attenuate that signal as well. And so that is what occurs in Parkinson's. When Parkinson's disease, you likely have a lack of dopamine production by a region called the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is a really important part of the brain that produces dopamine that targets the basal ganglia. Dopamine has so many other functions, mainly, especially for the MCAT, like reward and motivation, but that's actually a different nucleus that actually does those reward and motivation parts. But when you're talking about like the movement part of dopamine, which is related to the basal ganglia, that's the substantia nigra. So if you have a lack of the substantia nigra, you're not producing dopamine and basal ganglia cannot do its job. But then you need some way to move, right? How do we treat Parkinson's? And this is where L-Dopa comes in. Probably some people have heard of L-Dopa. L-Dopa is the precursor of dopamine, where we give patients L-Dopa in order for their body to turn that into dopamine in the brain so that they can actually have the dopamine so the basal ganglia can do its job. Fun fact, why don't we just give them dopamine? Like why make the body like do that last step? Why don't we just give them the dopamine and then they just do it in the brain? Well, the whole idea is because of this fancy dancy thing called the blood-brain barrier, right? Not everything we give to somebody can access the brain, and that barrier actually has transporters specific for L-Dopa. It's specific for L-Dopa. You give someone dopamine, it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. L-Dopa, there are transporters specific for it so that it can. You can get that L-Dopa in the brain, it can turn it into dopamine, and then basal ganglia can do its job of being the gatekeeper. So very, very testable area. This is a really great connection between like movement and neurotransmitters, specifically dopamine. A very, very testable area, so make sure that you know.
Yes.
Mhm.
And so we have Parkinson's on the side of I can't really move effectively,
Mhm.
right? Because of that dopamine loss. We also have kind of the other side of the spectrum. And I want to hear your thoughts on this because I know that this was something that you engaged with, at
Mhm.
least in passing in
Mhm.
research, but
Right.
that's Huntington's disease, right?
Right.
Which is the opposite side of the spectrum.
Yeah. So Huntington's disease is very cool. So what Molly's referring to is when I was doing research, our lab, which was a kind of a cancer research lab and all about like cell cycle, like S phase initiation. That was my research. We talked about the cell cycle, feels like ages ago. I remember when we talked about that. But we did an episode on
Forever.
that one, so that was really fun. But the lab that was next to us and that kind of our partner lab was all about Huntington's disease, which is something that is the exact opposite in that first, Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant trait, so it can be very, very kind of like prevalent because it's autosomal dominant, not recessive, like many traits are. But it's the idea that you have this aggregation of proteins that has so many issues, but the kind of one of the symptoms is you cannot suppress movement. In Huntington's, you have a failed suppression of movement. So you have not a difficulty to move, but way too much movement. So this is that it's kind of like opposite where it's like, and it's not like a difficulty, but it's just way, way too much because you can't suppress it. So it's kind of like the opposite side of the spectrum. I'm not going to dive into Huntington's too deep. I don't want to, because again, we were just a partner lab. Again, I didn't do the actual Huntington's research myself, but it is very, it's very intriguing pathology. Again, mainly because it's autosomal dominant, but it leads to this excessive movement because you can't suppress because of that protein aggregation.
Yes.
Mhm.
Right. And put together, all of this really does represent that first of the three phases that you were talking about, right?
Mhm.
We had initiation, we had coordination, and then we had actual execution, right?
Mhm.
So initiation, coordination, this really happens in the brain, right?
Mhm.
On its way back down to the spinal cord and then out through different layers of or levels of motor neurons to your actual muscles. So initiation, major players, just to recap, motor cortex in the frontal lobe and the basal ganglia. Now,
Mhm.
once the basal ganglia has kind of given its stamp of approval to the
Mhm.
certain motor movements that it's okay with carrying out, again, very important, we then pass through the thalamus and through the cerebellum as well, right? The cerebellum is really the major brain region that we want to keep in mind when we think of motor coordination, not initiation,
Hmm.
right? It's not generating any signals here. It's just making sure that you can carry out these signals and these patterns of muscle contraction in a way that is more fluid, right? So you can navigate the space around you in a more intentional way, right? So it's going to smooth the movements and make sure that all of these different muscles that are contracting at once are doing so in a coordinated manner in terms of time, right? So if you were going to, I don't know why I keep thinking swing a baseball bat. It's
Why
not
you
even
have been just
baseball
swinging?
season. It's
You
so
should,
random.
guys, you should have heard her before. She was talking about punching me and everything and removing. It was the worst. I was scared. I was scared. I'm in the camera and I'm scared.
Oh my goodness. I'm just thinking of like large scale movements, right? Let's say if you were going to play soccer, right? And you're running,
Hmm.
you want to make sure that you run and you kick. You want to kick with the foot that is okay to be off the ground at that
Hmm.
given
Hmm.
point in the cycle that you are running,
Yeah.
right? Like you need one foot on the ground so you don't fall. Um, in you want that to make you want to prevent falling if you're in the middle of a soccer game or whatever it is, right? You want to make sure that the muscles that are contracting, whether it's large scale or small scale, are timed properly,
Hmm.
and that you're maintaining balance. Okay, so
Hmm.
again, no initiation. If you saw damage to the cerebellum, what you're going to see is you will have movement. It's just a little bit less coordinated.
Yeah, a bit more clumsy kind of deal,
Oh,
right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that the cerebellum, sorry, there was like a little moment. But I was just gonna say the cerebellum is so cool because it's not just coordination, right? Like you said, it's the balance, right? So it's not always in the just like the big movements like running, but also just standing. Like right, like if you just like want to
Mhm.
balance like on that, it's involved in making sure that you can balance. You lift one foot, right? That's the cerebellum. That's coordinating those little muscles. There's so many muscles involved in that one leg to make sure that you stay
Yes.
balanced and like shifting your weight. That's a cerebellum. So if you ever see anyone like having a balance issue,
Yes.
100% cerebellar issue. You also can
Yeah.
think, what kind of situation would you also have balance issues?
Yeah.
Inebriation is one of those issues.
Inebriation.
So if you
Yeah.
have alcohol intoxication, you might have noticed that those who are intoxicated don't have the greatest balance. Well, it's because the cerebellum is inhibited in those cases. So therefore, it can't do its job as well. So that's why you feel if you ever partake, you feel a little off balance, it's because your cerebellum isn't working as well as it should be. Please drink responsibly. And so, I also kind
I
of with
love
one
that.
thing, like that's my note. As well, when it comes to the cerebellum, I always kind of think of it like it's this kind of region like on the brain. I always thought it was kind of cool because it's kind of this part of the brain that just kind of sticks out the back, and it's kind of like
Yep.
the Latin for it is like little brain. It's like this kind of
Mhm.
wrinkly part that's on the back, right beside the brainstem. And it's kind of just like that wrinkly bit at the back. I just find it cool that it's such a big area for this very core function, which is very interesting when you think about how important coordination and balance are, maybe to the early humans, I would say.
Aha.
I knew you would
Yeah,
like
I mean, I feel like
that.
it's so it feels so fun to imagine how life was thousands of years ago because nowadays, right? Like you can engage with so much of the world without actually ever moving, right? Especially with the internet, with all of our devices, like individuals who are unable to move can still lead incredibly fulfilling lives because the resources and the services and things like that that we have now are so different from historically how things have been, or I guess I should say in an evolutionary scale, maybe even prehistory if you want to call it that. But ultimately, movement is so core to survival for so many species that it feels, I hear often from students like, why don't we just have a simpler system? Why do we have to remember the motor cortex and the basal ganglia and the cerebellum and all the motor neurons and the spinal cord and like, why can't it just be simple? It's like you you don't want it to be simple, right? Like
Yeah.
you want it to be a complex system so that you can navigate your environment in a highly specific, balanced, coordinated way because you need to evade predators and you got to find food, right? Unless, like we said, you're a tree, in which
And that's
case,
your
rock
tree.
on. We love that for you.
You go chill, not moving. Actually, slightly moving, because I know trees do slightly move to face the sun, I believe. Again, that's my
That's a
evolutionary bias.
sunflower, but yes.
That's cool, cool, sick. I love that.
The
But plants,
trees,
some plants
or
do
the
move.
leaves,
The leaves, yeah, I'm pretty sure there was a
it
little
can
bit of movement
grow,
there
it will grow
in
in
that
the direction
direction.
of
That's
sunlight for
that's
sure,
what I
but
was thinking. I
not
was like,
face them.
yeah, yeah, my
That
tree's just turning
sunflowers can
around.
though.
Yeah.
Sunflowers are cool. Yeah.
But you see, notice that's so basic. So if you want to look at a simple nervous system, go check out trees. They probably have a pretty simple nervous system, if one at all.
Simple, simple. Nothing about plants and trees is simple. That's all I'm gonna say.
Oh my God.
Pretty
Luckily
cool
enough,
stuff.
it's not on the MCAT. That's true. Yeah, that's true. It is very complex. Thank goodness it's not on the MCAT.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but
yeah.
but yeah, but coming back to it, yeah, like 100%. It's so good that it's complex. But then again, when you actually understand them, they're like you don't try to memorize. Oh, motor cortex does this, basal ganglia, connect it together. It starts there, then it travels to basal ganglia, blocks it. Be like, hey, are you sure you should be going through? Oh, okay, actually you were meant to go through. Okay, great. Oh, cerebellum, make sure all those signals are working together, right? When you understand that way, it's actually really interesting, right? It's actually a really great thing to understand. Um,
Oh, yeah,
and and
absolutely.
so and so once you have those signals that are coordinated, okay, so now it's passed through all of those things. It's being coordinated now. Now it'll travel through, it'll go down through the spinal cord, go target whatever muscle that you're looking for, and then it will synapse to some muscle at the neuromuscular junction and do its job in going onto those muscles, contracting those muscles in a coordinated way. They're not all going to go, not all that signal is going to go to one muscle. Some will go to one muscle. Some will inhibit other muscles, right? To say like, hey, you want a bicep? Okay, tricep, you're not working right now. I need the bicep to be going right now, right? All of these will be sent. And if you are like, wait a minute, I really want to hear more about what happens at the muscle, you're in luck. Because we've done that episode. That was like weeks ago. You can go check that out. We did we did an episode, I think how many months ago? It feels like a long time ago where we
Maybe like
were
2 months ago.
maybe
Yeah.
yeah, maybe yeah, muscles and contraction where we talked about okay, now it's kind of like completing this story. Like we kind of started at the end. We did that end episode and now this is like the start of the story. Well, if you want to see how this story ends, go check out the muscle and contraction episode because now that's where we're kind of leaving you off here where it's like if you want
Yeah.
to see the execution, how the execution occurs, the third part of muscle contraction, I would go check out that episode.
Yeah. And we
Mhm.
even have like a middle ground in like nervous system function where we talked about how neurons work and how these messages are actually being, bounced back between different parts of the brain through motor neurons, etc. We've got a
Mhm.
lot. What I think is really cool, because really, like, once we go down through the spinal cord, out through the motor neurons, we synapse with the muscle contracts. What I think is really cool, not that the MCAT tests it in a huge way, but the actual movement of muscles, right, can also be sensed by internal stretch receptors and body receptors
Mm,
that help us actually feedback up to the brain again, back up to the cerebellum and the cortex to say, hey, this is how my body is oriented in space. How should I move now? Or like, oh, hey, I'm on one foot and I'm starting to fall. What do I do now? Like your body has internal receptors that can give feedback to the brain that aren't necessarily in creating movement, but more reporting back on the results of the movement or how the body is arranged, which can inform the next movement. So,
right.
absolutely fascinating. I love that we get to talk about this in detail because not only do so many students get, especially cerebellum and basal ganglia, mixed up, myself included from years ago, I hated those two parts of the brain, couldn't get them straight. But also, it's just so fascinating. And this
Right.
is one place where um, I always like to tell my students, use the world around you as a flashcard, right? Like if you're
Mm.
bored, you're sitting in a doctor's office or something and you're like just sitting there, before you grab your phone and you scroll on TikTok or Instagram or
Mhm.
whatever you like to do on your phone, play a phone game, look around, try and find something in your environment that reminds you of a topic you've covered. Okay, so that's
Mm.
a great one. If you're moving, hey, what are the parts of the brain? What are the parts of, my different body systems that are involved in creating that movement or suppressing movement if I'm not in motion, right? If you see a metal doorknob, hey, it's metal. What do I know about metals? It's a conductor, it's malleable, it's ductile, it's this, it's that, right? Like, oh, I see a blue shirt. What wavelengths of light are reaching your eye? How is it being absorbed or reflected from that person's shirt itself? How is the light entering your eye through your lens and onto your retina, right? Like, if you choose, you could make anything, any stimulus in the world around you to be a flashcard. If you're an Anki hater,
Like
hopefully you're
myself.
not a world hater. Use that instead.
Like, hey,
Yeah.
hey, I'm honestly again, I don't hate Anki. It just wasn't for me, and that's totally okay. There are some people like Molly who are Anki stans. They will Anki, and that's great. And And correctly.
With an
Anki,
asterisk, if you use Anki right,
exactly.
which
And
we made
hey,
a whole episode on, one of our very first for our
yeah, because
podcast.
it's that important, right? And
It's
I
that
totally
important.
agree.
If you
And
use it right,
if
I
you use
love
it right, it's
Anki.
amazing. If you use it wrong, yeah, you might as well
Waste
not
of
do it.
time.
But yeah, if you're like me and you're like, I'm not a huge Anki person, maybe there's other ways to reviews, like we talked about before. I know this was how I reviewed psychosocial a lot. Like what you just said was like I would do that all the time with psychosocial, where I would see something happen. I'm like, hey, like that's a great example. I always think actor observer bias because I see so much road rage. I'm like, oh,
Oh,
that's a great example of actor observer. Oh, that's a great example of the gambler's fallacy over there. Oh, wait, people going to the casino. I'm due, right? That's gambler's fallacy. Like it's
yeah.
always like when psychosocial was my area where I'm like I would do that all the time, but you can do it with any subject area on the MCAT. If you are like I can't do it with this subject, I challenge you. We can talk about come to for our free trial sessions, come to office hours, and we can talk about it how you can study in seeing the world around you. And speaking
Yes.
of things that are important in the world around you, that leads us to topic for next episode where we are going to discuss, we're going to go from a little bit away from the brain for a little bit, but then we'll come back, we promise. But we're going to talk about actually one of our favorite subjects because it's so critical, which is waves. And I know when I said that, some people were like, waves, I hate that. What are you talking? Physics? Ew, throw up. But waves is something that's so foundational and so interesting, especially in all the applications of waves. Because once you understand waves, you'll notice they are everywhere. I mean, legitimately everywhere around you right now, there are waves. So we're going to be diving into that next episode. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah. Actually, you know what? We're throwing waves at you right now
Mad
through
waves
the
at you right
speaker,
now. And you,
through
so
the
many
speaker
waves.
in your phone or your TV or whatever, however you're watching it, headphones. We are bombarding you with waves, actually,
Our
technically.
bad.
So get
That's
excited for additional bombardments with vibrational waves, traveling through the air. I'm very excited. Physics is something most people hate, but you know what? I love talking about physics.
it's so
It's so
fun.
cool. I think
It's
it's the
so
most
fun.
fun.
Mhm.
At least of the things that I like to use as real world flashcards, I think physics is sometimes the easiest,
I
at
think it
least
is
for
because
me.
I remember like
Everything is physics.
learning physics, like the amount. I don't think I ever had a class where I had so many demonstrations, like so
It's
many,
fun. It's
so there's so
cool.
many, like in I even my bio class, my chem class, lots of slides, lots of diagrams. Physics, we're doing games half the time, like we're playing games half the time, but it demonstrates these concepts. So, and waves is no exception, and we'll be discussing that next episode. So until then, happy studying, everybody. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.